Serafina Whitmore pressed her back against the cold brick wall of Hartwell's General Store, her heart hammering as footsteps approached the alley. She clutched the forbidden romance novel to her chest, knowing exactly what would happen if her father found her with it. Serafina May Whitmore. The deep voice made her blood freeze. Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore stood at the alley entrance, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the book in her hands. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across his weathered face. "Papa, I can explain. Give it here." His voice carried the same authority that commanded his congregation every Sunday. She reluctantly handed over the paperback, watching as he read the cover with disgust. "Passion's Promise." He shook his head. "What have I told you about filling your mind with such wickedness? It's just a story. Stories shape the soul, child, and your soul belongs to the Lord." He tucked the book into his coat pocket. "Home. Now." Serafina stepped out of the alley, her cheeks burning with shame and frustration. At 22, she felt like a prisoner in her own life. As they walked toward Main Street, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb outside the Millbrook Falls Inn. The man who emerged made her breath catch. Tall and lean, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that seemed out of place in their small Vermont town, he moved with a predatory grace that suggested danger beneath the polished exterior. Dark hair swept back from sharp features, and when he turned, his eyes met hers across the street. The world tilted. Those eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. Something electric passed between them, a recognition that made no sense yet felt undeniable. "Serafina." Her father's sharp voice snapped her back to reality. "Come along." But she couldn't look away from the stranger. He stood motionless beside his car, studying her with an intensity that made her skin flush. There was something almost predatory in his gaze, yet she didn't feel afraid. She felt awakened. "Who is that man?" she whispered. Reverend Whitmore glanced across the street, his expression darkening. "No one you need concern yourself with. Likely another city developer come to prey on our community." The stranger's lips curved into the hint of a smile, as if he'd heard the comment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pair of sunglasses, sliding them on before turning toward the inn. But not before giving Serafina one last lingering look that promised this wasn't over. Inside, her father commanded, gripping her elbow. As they walked toward their modest house beside the church, Serafina couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully ordered world had just shifted off its axis. The stranger's face was burned into her memory, along with the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and forbidden. That evening, as she helped her mother prepare dinner in their cramped kitchen, she found herself glancing out the window toward town. Somewhere out there was a man who had made her feel more alive in 30 seconds than she had in her entire sheltered existence. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Martha Whitmore observed, her gentle voice a stark contrast to her husband's harsh tones. "Just thinking, Mama." "About what?" Serafina hesitated. About storm gray eyes and expensive suits. About the way her heart had raced when a complete stranger looked at her. About the sudden, overwhelming certainty that her life was about to change forever. "Nothing important," she lied. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, she knew that wasn't true. The stranger had awakened something in her that had been sleeping her entire life. Something her father's strict rules and endless sermons had tried to bury. Something that felt like hunger. 3 days passed before Serafina saw him again. She had convinced herself that the stranger was just passing through, that the electric moment they'd shared was nothing more than her overactive imagination. But when she stepped out of Millbrook Community Church after Wednesday evening service, there he was, leaning against a lamppost across the street like he belonged there. The small crowd of congregants dispersed into the crisp October night, their hushed conversations about the sermon fading as they walked toward their cars. Serafina lingered on the church steps, pretending to look for something in her purse while stealing glances at the man who had haunted her thoughts. He wore dark jeans and a leather jacket now, looking more like he fit into their small town, yet somehow more dangerous than before. When the last parishioner drove away and her parents disappeared into the church to lock up, he pushed off from the lamppost and crossed the street. "You're Reverend Whitmore's daughter." His voice was as compelling as she remembered, with a slight rasp that suggested secrets. Up close, she could see the sharp lines of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, and those storm-gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her face. I am. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. And you're the developer my father mentioned. Something flickered across his features. Caspian Thorne. He didn't offer his hand, keeping his distance on the sidewalk below her. And I'm many things, but a developer isn't one of them. Then what brings you to Millbrook Falls? Business. The word was clipped, final. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was waging some internal battle. You should go inside, Serafina. The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. How do you know? Small town. Word travels. He took a step back, his jaw tightening. Go inside. But she didn't move. For the first time in her life, she found herself unwilling to do what she was told. What kind of business? The kind that's none of your concern. His tone had gone cold, but his eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that contradicted his words. The church door opened behind her, and her father's voice carried across the night air. Serafina? What are you doing out there? When she turned back to the street, Caspian was gone. The next morning, she found herself taking a different route to the library where she volunteered twice a week. Instead of walking directly down Maple Street, she took the long way past the inn, telling herself she was just enjoying the autumn scenery. He was sitting on the inn's front porch, a cup of coffee in his hands and a laptop open on the small table beside him. When he saw her approach, he closed the computer with deliberate precision. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Thorne. She stopped at the white picket fence that bordered the inn's property, her heart doing that strange racing thing again. Beautiful morning. Is it? He hadn't taken his eyes off her face. I hadn't noticed. The words hung between them, loaded with implication. She gripped the fence post, feeling suddenly breathless. What do you do for work, really? I solve problems. What kind of problems? The expensive kind. He stood, moving to the porch railing that brought him closer to where she stood. The kind that could get innocent people hurt if they asked too many questions. There was warning in his voice, but also something else. Something that sounded almost like concern. Are you trying to scare me? Yes. The honesty in his answer surprised her. You should be scared of me, Serafina. You should walk away and never look back. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, drawn by the contradiction between his words and the way he was looking at her. But you don't want me to. His knuckles went white as he gripped the railing. What I want is irrelevant. Is it? The boldness of her own question shocked her. She had never spoken to a man this way, never felt this strange combination of fear and attraction that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts scatter. You don't know what you're asking. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of. Then tell me. For a moment, she thought he might. His storm-gray eyes searched her face with such intensity that she felt exposed, as if he could see every secret thought she'd ever had. Then his expression shuddered, and he stepped back from the railing. Go home, Serafina. Marry some nice boy from your father's congregation and forget you ever saw me. But as she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back, and she knew with absolute certainty that forgetting him would be impossible. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of their conversation. For 22 years, she had followed every rule, obeyed every commandment, never questioned the narrow path her father had laid out for her life. Now, for the first time, she found herself wondering what lay beyond that path, and whether she was brave enough to find out. Serafina had never been one to disobey, but she found herself inventing excuses to walk past the inn every day for the next week. Each time, Caspian was there, as if he were waiting for her. They would exchange a few careful words, nothing that could be considered improper, yet the air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. On Thursday afternoon, she was returning from the library with an armload of books when she nearly collided with him outside Murphy's hardware store. The books scattered across the sidewalk, and they both knelt to gather them up. Sorry, she breathed, reaching for a fallen novel at the same moment his hand closed over it. Their fingers touched, and the simple contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. She looked up to find his face mere inches from hers, those storm-gray eyes dark with something she didn't fully understand but desperately wanted to. Serafina. Her name sounded different when he said it, like a prayer or a curse. Yes. Instead of answering, he helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her elbow longer than necessary. You're playing with fire. Maybe I want to get burned." The words escaped before she could stop them, shocking them both. Color flooded her cheeks, but she didn't look away. For a moment, neither of them moved, the busy street fading around them until nothing existed except the space between their bodies and the weight of what she'd just admitted. "Meet me tomorrow night," he said quietly. "The old covered bridge on Millstream Road. 9 o'clock. "I can't. Papa would never." "Don't tell him." His voice was rough, urgent. "1 hour, Serafina. That's all I'm asking." She should have said no. Should have gathered her books and walked away without looking back. Instead, she found herself nodding, sealing a fate she didn't yet understand. The next evening, she told her parents she was going to visit Sarah Hutchins, a friend from church who lived on the edge of town. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but not bitter enough to stop her from slipping out the back door at 8:45. The covered bridge was a remnant from the 1800s, rarely used since the new highway bypass was built. Moonlight filtered through the wooden slats, casting intricate shadows across the weathered planks. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. "You came. Did you think I wouldn't? I hoped you'd be smarter than this." But there was relief in his voice, and something else that made her pulse quicken. He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that seemed to wrap around her senses. In the dim light, he looked more dangerous than ever, all sharp angles and predatory grace. "Why did you ask me here?" "Because I'm losing my mind." The confession seemed torn from him. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, and I know I should stay away." "Then why don't you?" "Because I'm selfish. Because for the first time in years, I want something that isn't tainted by my past." He reached up, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "Because looking at you makes me remember what it feels like to be human." The touch was featherlight, but it might as well have been lightning. She leaned into it without thinking, her eyes fluttering closed as his thumb traced the line of her jaw. Serafina. Her name was a warning, a plea, a surrender all at once. When she opened her eyes, he was staring at her with an expression of such raw hunger that it stole her breath. This was what she'd sensed beneath his controlled exterior, this fierce need that mirrored her own. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered. "Neither do I." His hand moved to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. "I should walk away. Should let you go back to your safe little world and pretend this never happened. But you won't." "No. God help me, I won't." When his lips finally found hers, it was nothing like the chaste kisses she'd imagined from romance novels. This was fire and desperation, a claiming that left no room for doubt about his intentions. She melted against him, her hands fisting in his jacket as he backed her against the bridge's wooden wall. His mouth moved over hers with practiced skill, teaching her things she'd never dreamed of wanting to learn. When his tongue traced the seam of her lips, she gasped, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss until she was dizzy with sensation. "This is insane," he breathed against her mouth, but his hands were already exploring, sliding down her sides to rest at her waist. "Yes," she agreed, not caring about sanity anymore. Nothing had ever felt as right as being in his arms, as necessary as the weight of his body pressed against hers. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, trading kisses and whispered confessions in the shadows of the old bridge. He told her about the loneliness that had become his constant companion, about the way she'd awakened something in him he'd thought was long dead. She told him about the suffocating weight of expectations, about the dreams she'd never dared voice aloud. When they finally broke apart, her lips were swollen and her carefully pinned hair had come loose around her shoulders. He stared at her like she was something miraculous, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. "I should take you home." "Not yet." The words surprised her with their boldness. "Please, not yet. Serafina, if we keep this up." "What? What will happen?" She looked up at him, this dangerous man who had somehow become essential to her breathing. "Will you ruin me?" "Because I'm beginning to think I want to be ruined." The confession hung between them like a live wire, crackling with possibility and peril. In the distance, the church bell chimed 10 o'clock, reminding her that she was already later than she'd planned. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care about the consequences. She was falling for a man who carried shadows in his eyes and secrets in his smile, and she was helpless to stop it. Their secret meetings became a ritual over the following weeks. Always at different locations, always careful to avoid being seen. The abandoned mill by the river, the old cemetery at the edge of town, the hiking trail that wound through the state forest. Each encounter left Serafina more addicted to the taste of forbidden fruit. Caspian was teaching her things about herself she'd never imagined. The way her breath caught when he traced patterns on her skin. How her body came alive under his touch, responding to needs she'd been taught to suppress. But along with the intoxicating rush of discovery came questions he wouldn't answer. "Why won't you tell me where you're from?" she asked one evening as they sat on a fallen log overlooking Miller's Pond. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Because it doesn't matter. It matters to me." She lifted her head to look at him. "I've told you everything about my life, but you're still a stranger." Something dark flickered across his features. "You wouldn't like the answers, Serafina. Try me." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "I grew up in places where survival meant becoming someone else, where trust was a luxury that could get you killed. That sounds like you were in some kind of danger." "I was the danger." The admission hung between them like a blade. "I've done things that would make you run screaming back to your father's church." She studied his profile in the moonlight, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists. "What kind of things?" "The kind that can't be undone." He turned to face her, his storm-gray eyes haunted. "I'm not a good man, Serafina. I never have been. I don't believe that." "Then you're naive." The harsh words should have stung, but instead they made her more determined. "Show me." "What?" "If you're so terrible, show me. Prove it." Instead of answering, he kissed her with a desperation that spoke of endings rather than beginnings. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she could taste something like goodbye on his lips. The next morning brought the first real crack in her carefully constructed world. She came downstairs to find her father on the phone in his study, his voice hushed but agitated. The door was slightly ajar, and she caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "I told you, I can't do any more. People are starting to ask questions." A pause. "You don't understand. This is a small town. If anyone finds out about the deposits..." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't care what you'll do to me, but if you threaten my family again, I'll go to the authorities." The phone slammed down with enough force to rattle the windows. Serafina pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering. Her father had always been a pillar of moral certainty, but the man she'd just heard sounded frightened and desperate. When he emerged from the study moments later, his face was ashen. He stopped short when he saw her, quickly arranging his features into their usual stern mask. "Serafina, how long have you been standing there?" "I just came down." "Papa, is everything all right?" "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" But his eyes didn't meet hers, and she noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he straightened his collar. Over the next few days, she watched her father with new eyes. The way he jumped every time the phone rang. How he'd taken to locking his study door, something he'd never done before. The dark circles under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping. She was so preoccupied with her father's strange behavior that she almost missed the other signs. The way conversation stopped when she entered the post office. How Martha Coleman quickly changed the subject when Serafina approached her at the grocery store. The subtle tension that seemed to have settled over the entire town like fog. It was Caspian who finally connected the dots for her, though not in the way she expected. They were meeting at the old mill again, hidden in the shadows of the massive water wheel, when she mentioned her father's odd behavior. "He's scared of something," she said, her head pillowed on Caspian's shoulder. "I've never seen him like this." She felt his body go rigid beneath her. "What exactly did you hear him say?" Something in his tone made her lift her head to look at him. His expression had gone carefully blank, the same mask he wore when he was hiding something. "Caspian, what is it? Tell me exactly what you heard." She repeated the conversation as best she could remember, watching as his face grew increasingly grim. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out at the dark water. "I have to go." "What? What?" He was already standing, pulling away from her in more ways than one. "This was a mistake. All of it. Caspian, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." He turned to face her, and the man looking back was a stranger. Cold, calculating, dangerous. "Stay away from me, Serafina. Don't come to any more meetings. Don't look for me. Just pretend this never happened." "I don't understand." "You don't need to understand. You just need to do what I'm telling you. He was backing away now, putting distance between them that felt like miles. Go home. Forget about me. I can't do that. You can. You will. His voice was like ice. Because if you don't, people are going to get hurt. People you care about. Before she could respond, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the mill. She stood there alone, the echo of his footsteps fading until only the sound of moving water remained. As she walked home through the empty streets, one thought kept circling through her mind. The timing of his sudden coldness, coming right after she'd told him about her father's mysterious phone call, couldn't be coincidence. Whatever was happening in Millbrook Falls, whatever had her father so frightened, Caspian knew about it. The question was whether he was trying to protect her from it, or whether he was part of it himself. The possibility that the man she was falling in love with might be connected to her father's terror made her feel sick. But it also made her more determined than ever to find out the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. Caspian spent the next 48 hours in his hotel room, surrounded by files and laptop screens, diving deeper into the financial irregularities he'd been tracking. What he found made his blood run cold. The Whitmore family wasn't just peripherally connected to the organization he'd been hunting. They were at the center of an elaborate money laundering scheme that had been operating for over 2 years, using the church's donation accounts as a pipeline for dirty money. But the more he dug, the clearer it became that Reverend Whitmore wasn't a willing participant. The deposits were too large, too frequent, and the withdrawal patterns suggested someone was forcing the transactions. Cross-referencing with known associates of the Kozlov syndicate, Caspian found the smoking gun he'd been looking for. Viktor Petrov, a mid-level enforcer with a talent for finding pressure points and exploiting them. If Petrov was in Millbrook Falls, it meant the organization had found something they could use against the Reverend, something valuable enough to make him cooperate. Caspian's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Agent Delilah Cross at Treasury. Asset confirmed in area. Pressure increasing. Need intel ASAP. He stared at the message, his hands trembling slightly. The asset they were tracking wasn't just any money launderer. It was Alexei Kozlov's accountant, the man who knew every detail of the organization's financial network. If they could flip him, they could bring down the entire operation. But getting to him meant using the Reverend as bait. And using the Reverend meant putting Serafina directly in harm's way. His phone rang. The number was one he recognized but had hoped never to see again. Hello, Thorne. Victor's accent was thick, menacing. Enjoying your vacation in our little town? Caspian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his past crushing down on him. Victor, you sound surprised. Did you think we wouldn't notice you sniffing around our business? I'm not here for you. Of course you are. Once Kozlov family, always Kozlov family. Isn't that what you used to say? The words were like acid in his throat. For 3 years, he'd been part of their inner circle, trusted with their darkest secrets because he'd proven himself willing to cross any line for money. They didn't know he'd been feeding information to law enforcement the entire time, but that didn't make his crimes any less real. What do you want, Victor? A reunion? Tonight. The old Hartwell warehouse on Industrial Road. Come alone. And if I don't, then the Good Reverend's congregation learns some very interesting things about where their donations have been going. And maybe his pretty daughter learns what happens to families who disappoint us. The line went dead. Caspian sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the phone. 3 years of careful planning, of building a case that could destroy the Kozlov organization forever, and it all came down to this. He could walk into that warehouse and try to maintain his cover, gathering the evidence needed to finish the job. Or he could run, disappearing into witness protection and leaving Serafina and her family to face Victor's wrath alone. Neither option guaranteed her safety. At 9 o'clock that evening, he drove to the warehouse district on the outskirts of town. The Hartwell building had been abandoned for decades, its broken windows and rusted siding a testament to Millbrook Falls' economic decline. Victor's black Mercedes was already there, along with 2 other vehicles he didn't recognize. The inside of the warehouse was lit by a few scattered work lights, casting long shadows between empty shipping containers. Victor stood in the center of the space, flanked by 2 men Caspian didn't know. But it was the 4th man that made his blood freeze. Alexei Kozlov himself, the head of the organization, a man rumored to have personally killed more than 30 people. He was smaller than Caspian remembered, but his pale blue eyes held the same cold intelligence that had made him one of the most feared crime bosses on the East Coast. Caspian. Kozlov's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the empty space. My prodigal son returns. Alexei. 3 years, and not so much as a phone call. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your old friends. Caspian forced himself to remain calm, to slip back into the role that had nearly destroyed his soul. I've been keeping a low profile, like we discussed. Yes, your mysterious consulting business. Very convenient. Kozlov circled him slowly, like a predator evaluating prey. Tell me, what brings you to our little operation here? Curiosity. I heard through the grapevine that you'd found a new revenue stream. Indeed we have. The American appetite for charitable giving is quite remarkable. All that money, flowing through accounts with so little oversight. He stopped in front of Caspian, those pale eyes boring into his. But I think you know this already. I know you've been using the church. Among other things, the Reverend has been most cooperative once we explain the consequences of refusing our generous offer. What kind of consequences? Kozlov smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Caspian had ever seen. The kind that involved his daughter. Such a lovely girl. So innocent. So trusting. Every muscle in Caspian's body tensed. She's not part of this. Everyone is part of this, my friend. That's the beauty of small towns. Touch one thread, and the whole web vibrates. He moved closer, his voice dropping to barely audible. Which brings me to an interesting question. Why have you been spending so much time with the Reverend's daughter? The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Caspian's own heartbeat. They knew. Somehow, despite all his precautions, they knew about Serafina. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. Kozlov gestured to Victor, who produced a tablet and swiped through several photos. Caspian and Serafina at the covered bridge, walking together by Miller's Pond, her head on his shoulder at the old mill. Touching, Kozlov said. Though I must say, I'm disappointed in your taste. A preacher's daughter? Really, Caspian, you used to have more sophisticated preferences. It's nothing serious. I hope not. Because if I thought you were developing feelings for our little insurance policy, well, that would complicate things considerably. The threat was clear. Serafina wasn't just collateral damage anymore. She was leverage. And as long as Caspian cared about her, Kozlov owned him completely. What do you want from me? The same thing I've always wanted. Your loyalty, your skills, your complete and total dedication to our cause. Kozlov's smile widened. Fortunately, you've already given me the perfect motivation to ensure your cooperation. As Caspian drove back to town an hour later, his hands shaking with rage and terror, he finally understood the full scope of the trap he'd walked into. By falling for Serafina, by allowing himself to care about someone again, he'd handed his enemies the one weapon guaranteed to destroy him. The only way to protect her was to break her heart, to become the monster she'd never believe him capable of being, to sacrifice the first pure thing he'd found in years on the altar of his own sins. But even as he made the choice, he knew it might already be too late. Kozlov's reach was long, and his memory was longer. And men like that never forgot a debt or forgave a betrayal. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Serafina was sleeping peacefully in her bed, still believing in fairy tales and happy endings. Tomorrow, he would have to destroy that faith forever. It was the only way to keep her alive. Serafina knew something was wrong the moment she saw Caspian's car parked outside the church the next morning. He was leaning against the driver's side door, but this wasn't the man who had held her in the shadows of the old mill. This was someone else entirely. Gone was the carefully controlled demeanor she'd grown accustomed to. In its place was something colder, more predatory. He wore an expensive suit that looked like armor, and when he looked at her, there was no warmth in those storm gray eyes. Only calculation. We need to talk. Caspian, what's wrong? You disappeared last night. Get in the car. The command in his voice made her step back. I don't understand. You don't need to understand. Just get in. Against her better judgment, she climbed into the passenger seat. He drove them out of town in silence, his jaw set like granite, his hands gripping the steering wheel with enough force to turn his knuckles white. They ended up at the scenic overlook on Mountain View Road, a spot where teenagers came to park and tourists stopped to take pictures. At 10 in the morning, it was deserted except for them and the vast expanse of Vermont countryside stretching out below. This was fun while it lasted, he said without preamble, not bothering to look at her. What? You? This? Whatever you want to call it. He finally turned to face her, and the man looking back was a stranger. But it's over now. The words hit her like a physical blow. I don't believe you. Believe whatever you want. It doesn't change anything. Something happened. Last night, after I told you about Papa's phone call, something changed. What was it? For just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the man she'd fallen for. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. You want to know what happened? I got bored. His voice was flat, emotionless. You were a distraction, Serafina. A way to pass the time in this backwater town. That's not true, isn't it? Did you really think someone like me could be interested in someone like you for anything more than a quick thrill? Each word was designed to wound, and they found their mark with devastating accuracy. She felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. You're lying. Am I? Look at yourself. A sheltered preacher's daughter who'd never even been kissed before me. What could you possibly offer a man like me beyond novelty? The cruelty in his voice was so complete, so absolute, that for a moment she couldn't breathe. This was the man who had whispered sweet confessions in her ear, who had touched her like she was something precious. How had she been so wrong about him? Why are you doing this? Because it's time you learned how the real world works. Men like me don't fall for girls like you. We use them. She slapped him then, the sound echoing through the car like a gunshot. His head snapped to the side with the force of it, but when he looked back at her, there was still no emotion in his eyes. Feel better? Go to hell. Already there, sweetheart. She fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the car and the man who had just eviscerated her heart. Don't ever come near me again. I won't. As she walked away down the mountain road, she heard his engine start behind her. He passed her without slowing, without looking back, leaving her alone with the wreckage of everything she'd thought she knew about love. What Serafina didn't see was Caspian pulling over half a mile down the road, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The look in her eyes when he delivered those calculated cruelties would haunt him for the rest of his life. But it was necessary. It was the only way to keep her safe from what was coming. His phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Impressive performance. Boss wants to see you tonight. Same place. Caspian closed his eyes, forcing himself back into the role that felt like wearing a dead man's skin. By the time he opened them again, the man who had fallen in love with a preacher's daughter was buried so deep he might never surface again. That evening, he met with Kozlov again at the warehouse. This time, the crime boss seemed more relaxed, almost jovial. I have to admit, I'm impressed, Kozlov said, pouring 2 glasses of expensive vodka. The way you handled the girl today was masterful. Cold, efficient, final. She was becoming a liability. Indeed. Though I suspect she meant more to you than you're admitting. Caspian accepted the glass, his expression giving nothing away. She was useful for gathering information about the father. Nothing more. Of course. Kozlov's smile was razor-sharp. Well, now that we've eliminated that distraction, perhaps you'd like to hear about our expansion plans. For the next hour, Kozlov outlined the organization's operations in excruciating detail. Money laundering through dozens of small-town churches across New England. Drug distribution networks that used religious charities as fronts. Even human trafficking disguised as refugee assistance programs. Caspian listened, memorized, and filed every detail away for Agent Cross. The recording device hidden in his watch captured it all, evidence that would finally bring down the entire network. But the cost was becoming clearer with every passing minute. To maintain his cover, he would have to become complicit in horrors that made his past crimes look like misdemeanors. And somewhere in Millbrook Falls, Serafina was probably crying herself to sleep, believing that the man she'd given her heart to had never existed at all. When the meeting finally ended, Caspian drove back to the inn through empty streets. His room felt like a tomb, filled with the ghost of the man he'd been when he still believed in redemption. He sat at his laptop and typed out a secure message to Agent Cross. Kozlov confirmed an area. Full network details attached. Asset location still unknown. Cover intact, but deteriorating. Request immediate backup and extraction timeline. The response came within minutes. Backup en route. Maintain cover at all costs. Asset confirmed mobile. Expected contact within 48 hours. Do not compromise operation. At all costs. The phrase echoed in his mind as he stared out his window toward the church where Serafina's bedroom light had finally gone dark. He had crossed a line today that couldn't be uncrossed, had said things that couldn't be unsaid. Even if he somehow survived what was coming, even if they managed to bring down Kozlov and his entire organization, Serafina would never forgive him for what he'd done. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was better that she hate him than love a man who had spent years swimming in blood and lies. But as he finally fell into a restless sleep, her face was the last thing he saw. Not the way she'd looked when he destroyed her, but the way she'd looked in the moonlight at the covered bridge when she'd told him she wanted to be ruined. He'd kept that promise, just not in the way either of them had expected. 2 days later, everything changed again. Caspian was having breakfast at the inn when a woman in a dark suit approached his table. She was tall, blonde, and moved with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to command. "Mr. Thorne?" "Agent Delilah Cross, Treasury Department." She flashed her credentials quickly. "We need to talk." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, his expression carefully neutral. To anyone watching, it would look like a business meeting. The asset made contact, she said quietly, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Tomorrow night. Kozlov's moving him to a secure location, which means this is our only chance." Caspian opened the folder, scanning the surveillance photos and financial documents inside. "What's the plan?" "You maintain your cover, get close to the asset during transport. We'll have teams positioned at 3 intercept points. And the Whitmores will be protected once we have Kozlov in custody." Her blue eyes were hard as diamonds. "But not before. We can't risk tipping him off. The daughter doesn't know anything. She's innocent in all this. Innocent people get hurt in operations like this, Thorne. You know that better than anyone." The words were like ice water in his veins. He'd spent 3 years building this case, sacrificing everything that mattered to him, and now they were telling him that Serafina's safety was expendable. There has to be another way. There isn't. Cross leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You've done good work here, but don't let personal feelings compromise the mission. Too much is at stake." As she gathered the folder and prepared to leave, Caspian found himself thinking about Serafina's face when she'd slapped him, the pain and betrayal in her eyes. He'd told himself it was necessary, that keeping her at a distance would protect her. But now he was beginning to realize that in a game this deep, this dangerous, there might be no such thing as protection. Only survival, and the terrible choices that came with it. The question was whether he could live with those choices, or whether they would finally destroy what was left of his soul. Serafina had spent 3 days in a fog of misery, going through the motions of her daily routine while feeling like someone had carved out her heart with a rusty knife. She helped her mother with household chores, attended prayer meetings, and smiled when people spoke to her, but inside she felt hollow. The worst part was that her father seemed to be getting worse. His hands shook constantly now, and she'd caught him burning papers in the fireplace at 2 in the morning. When she'd asked him about it, he'd snapped at her with a ferocity that left her speechless. "Mind your own business, Serafina. Some things are better left buried." She was walking home from the post office on Friday afternoon when the black sedan pulled up beside her. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it might be Caspian, but the woman who emerged was a stranger. Tall, blonde, and wearing a dark suit that screamed federal agent. "Miss Whitmore?" "Agent Delilah Cross, Treasury Department. I need to speak with you." Serafina's blood went cold. "About what?" "About Caspian Thorne, and about what's really been happening in your town." They drove to a small diner 20 miles outside Millbrook Falls, where Agent Cross ordered coffee for both of them and spread several photographs across the scarred Formica table. Serafina recognized some of them immediately, surveillance shots of her father, of various town council members, of people she'd known her entire life. "Your father is in serious trouble, Miss Whitmore. But he's not the criminal here." "I don't understand." Cross pulled out another photograph, this one showing a man Serafina didn't recognize. Middle-aged, with pale eyes and thinning hair. Alexei Kozlov, head of one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations on the East Coast. For the past 2 years, his people have been using your father's church to launder money. "That's impossible. Papa would never." "You're right. He wouldn't." Which is why they found leverage to force his cooperation. Cross produced another photo, and Serafina's world tilted. It was her, taken with a telephoto lens, walking down Main Street. There were others, her at the library, at the grocery store, leaving church after evening service. They've been watching you, Miss Whitmore. Your father knows that if he doesn't cooperate, you'll pay the price. The coffee turned to acid in her stomach. How long have you known about this? We've been building a case for 3 years. The operation to bring down Kozlov's network has required deep cover infiltration. Cross hesitated, then pulled out one final photograph. This one showed Caspian, but not as she'd ever seen him. He was younger, harder, standing next to men who looked like they belonged in a crime movie. The timestamp showed it was taken 4 years ago. Caspian Thorne has been working undercover for us since 2019. He infiltrated Kozlov's organization by becoming one of them, doing things that will probably haunt him for the rest of his life. But every piece of information he gathered brought us closer to shutting them down. Serafina stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. You're saying he's a federal agent? Not exactly. He's a civilian contractor, what we call a deep cover asset. He spent 3 years inside Kozlov's inner circle, building trust, gathering evidence. When we learned they were expanding operations to small towns in New England, we sent him to Millbrook Falls to investigate. And me? The question came out as barely a whisper. Was an unexpected complication. Cross's expression softened slightly. He wasn't supposed to fall in love with you, Miss Whitmore. It compromised his ability to maintain his cover. So everything he said to me, the way he ended things, was an act designed to protect you. When Kozlov's people discovered your relationship, they made it clear that you would be used as leverage against both Caspian and your father. The only way to keep you safe was to convince them that you meant nothing to him. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. All the cruel words, the calculated indifference, the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing. It had all been an elaborate lie designed to save her life. Where is he now? Getting ready to risk everything to bring these people down. Tomorrow night, they're moving a high-value asset, someone who can give us the evidence we need to destroy the entire network. Caspian will be part of the transport team. That sounds dangerous. It is. There's a good chance he won't survive it. Cross leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. Which is why I'm here. We need your help. My help? I don't understand. Your father has been keeping detailed records of every transaction they've forced him to make. Bank statements, deposit slips, correspondence, everything. We need those records, but we can't get them without alerting Kozlov's people. Serafina's mind was spinning. You want me to steal from my own father. I want you to help us save him, and everyone else in this town who's been caught up in this nightmare. Cross gathered the photographs, her movements efficient and precise. We have reason to believe that once this transport is complete, Kozlov plans to eliminate all the loose ends. That includes your father, several other townspeople, and quite possibly you. The words landed like hammer blows. When? Soon. Maybe within days. Cross handed her a business card. Think about what I've told you, Miss Whitmore. If you decide to help us, call the number on that card. But don't take too long. Time is running out for everyone. As Serafina drove back to Millbrook Falls in a daze, her mind kept returning to one central truth. Caspian hadn't betrayed her. Everything he'd done, every cruel word he'd spoken, had been to protect her from monsters she'd never imagined existed. She thought about the pain in his eyes when he'd told her it was over, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. She'd been so focused on her own hurt that she'd missed the signs of his. That evening, she waited until her parents were asleep before slipping into her father's study. The room smelled of old books and desperation, and she could see the stress in every detail. The overflowing ashtray, the empty bottle of antacids, the stack of unopened mail. She found what she was looking for in the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath old sermon notes. A manila folder filled with bank statements, copies of deposit slips, and what looked like correspondence written in a foreign language. Her father's handwriting was scrawled in the margins, documenting dates and amounts with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on accuracy. As she photographed each document with her phone, tears blurred her vision. Her father wasn't a criminal. He was a victim, trapped between protecting his family and maintaining his principles. The weight of that knowledge, of understanding the impossible choice he'd been forced to make, threatened to crush her. When she was finished, she called the number Agent Cross had given her. "I have what you need," she said when Cross answered. "But I want something in return." "What?" "I want to help bring them down." All of them. Miss Whitmore, that's not. They threatened my father. They used me as leverage. They turned my town into their personal criminal enterprise. Her voice was steady now, fueled by a rage she'd never known she possessed. I want them to pay for what they've done. There was a long pause. It's dangerous. If something goes wrong, then at least I'll go down fighting instead of hiding. She thought about Caspian, somewhere out there preparing to risk his life for justice. Besides, someone I care about is already in danger. I'm not going to sit on the sidelines while he faces it alone. All right, Cross said finally. But we do this my way. No heroics, no deviations from the plan. Can you handle that? Yes. Then meet me tomorrow at the old logging road near Crane's Mill. 6 p.m. sharp. And Miss Whitmore? Yes. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not your parents, not your friends, no one. These people have eyes and ears everywhere, and trust is a luxury we can't afford. As Serafina hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Tomorrow night, she would see Caspian again. And this time, instead of being the helpless victim in need of protection, she would stand beside him as an equal. She didn't know if they would survive what was coming, but she knew that facing it together was better than spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been. In the darkness outside her window, she thought she saw a figure watching the house. But when she looked again, there was nothing but shadows and the wind moving through the trees. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out faster than any of them realized. The old logging road near Crane's Mill was shrouded in mist when Serafina arrived at 6 p.m. sharp. Agent Cross was already there, along with 2 other federal agents she didn't recognize. They'd transformed the abandoned ranger station into a makeshift command center, complete with surveillance equipment and tactical gear. The transport happens at midnight, Cross explained, pointing to a map spread across a folding table. Kozlov's moving his accountant from the warehouse to a private airfield outside Rutland. Caspian will be in the lead vehicle with Victor and 2 other operatives. Serafina studied the route they'd marked in red. Where do I come in? Your father received a call this afternoon. He's been ordered to meet them at the warehouse at 11:30 to make one final large withdrawal from the church accounts. They want him there as insurance, in case anything goes wrong with the transport. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While Caspian maintained his cover during the transport, Serafina would help her father during what they hoped would be the final transaction. Federal agents would be positioned at multiple points along the route, ready to move when Caspian gave the signal. What's the signal? Serafina asked. He'll activate a tracking beacon when the accountant is secured in the vehicle. That gives us their exact location and confirms the asset is in custody. At 11 p.m., Serafina drove her father to the warehouse district. His hands shook as he clutched a briefcase containing bank authorization forms, and his face was gray with terror. Papa, it's going to be all right, she said softly. How can you know that? His voice was hollow. These people, Serafina, they're not human. They're demons wearing human faces. Because sometimes angels wear human faces too. When they arrived at the warehouse, Victor was waiting with the same 2 men from before. But there was no sign of Caspian or Kozlov. Serafina felt a stab of fear. Had something gone wrong? Reverend Whitmore, Victor's accented voice carried across the empty space. Punctual as always. And you brought your lovely daughter. She's not part of this, her father said quickly. Of course not. She's just here to ensure your continued cooperation. Victor's smile was predatory. Please, make the transaction. We have a schedule to keep. Her father's hands shook as he pulled out his phone to authorize the electronic transfer. Serafina watched the numbers scroll across the screen. $200,000. More money than their church saw in a year. That's when she heard it. The sound of car engines approaching fast. Victor heard it too, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Expecting company? Her father asked. Before Victor could answer, the warehouse doors exploded inward. Federal agents poured through the openings, weapons drawn, shouting commands. In the chaos, Serafina saw her father drop the briefcase and grab her hand. This way, he whispered, pulling her toward a side exit. But Victor was faster. His gun was in his hand before they'd taken 3 steps. The barrel pointed directly at Serafina's chest. Nobody moves, he snarled, or the girl dies. The federal agents froze, their weapons trained on Victor, but unable to fire without risking her life. In the sudden stillness, She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. That's when Caspian appeared. He came through the side entrance like a shadow made flesh, moving with deadly precision. Victor never saw him coming. One moment the gun was pointed at Serafina's heart. The next it was flying across the warehouse floor as Caspian's arm wrapped around Victor's throat. "It's over," Caspian said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Victor struggled for a moment, then went limp as Caspian applied pressure to the carotid artery. The federal agents moved in immediately, securing the unconscious enforcer and his companions. Serafina stood frozen, staring at the man who had just saved her life. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit rumpled and stained, but his storm-gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "No, She started toward him, then stopped. "Is it really over?" "Kozlov's in custody. His accountant is cooperating. The entire network is coming down." He took a step closer, then hesitated. "Serafina, the things I said to you. Agent Cross told me." The words came out in a rush. "She told me everything. About who you really are, about what you've been doing, about why you had to push me away." Something flickered across his features. Relief, maybe, or hope. "Can you forgive me?" Instead of answering, she closed the distance between them and threw her arms around his neck. He held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, his face buried in her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "Never." She pulled back to look at him, seeing past the exhaustion to the man she'd fallen in love with. "I don't care what you've done or who you had to pretend to be. I know who you really are." "Do you?" His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd shed. "Because I'm not sure I do anymore. You're the man who sacrificed everything to protect innocent people. You're the man who broke your own heart to keep me safe. You're the man I love." When he kissed her this time, it was different from before. There was desperation in it, and relief, and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to hope for. They were interrupted by Agent Cross clearing her throat. "Sorry to break this up, but we need statements from both of you. And Mr. Thorne, there are some people in Washington who want to debrief you extensively." "How long will that take?" Serafina asked. "A few weeks, maybe a month. There's a lot to sort through." Caspian's arms tightened around her. "I'll come back. I promise. I'll be here." 6 months later, the wedding was small, held in the same church where Serafina's father had been forced to launder money for criminals. But now the sanctuary was filled with nothing but love and hope. Reverend Whitmore performed the ceremony himself, his voice strong and clear as he spoke about forgiveness and redemption. Caspian had spent 2 months in Washington, helping federal prosecutors build cases against every member of Kozlov's organization. The media had called it the largest takedown of organized crime in New England history. But for him, the real victory was standing at the altar watching Serafina walk down the aisle in her mother's wedding dress. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness as she approached. When she reached him, he took her hands and felt the last of his old life fall away. The man who had lived in shadows and lies was gone, replaced by someone worthy of the love shining in her eyes. "Dearly beloved," her father began, and Caspian found himself thinking about second chances and the grace that made them possible. 5 years later, Serafina sat on the porch swing of their farmhouse outside Millbrook Falls, watching Caspian chase their 3-year-old daughter Emma around the yard. The little girl's laughter filled the air as she dodged her father's playful attempts to catch her. "Got you," he said, scooping Emma up and spinning her around until she squealed with delight. "Again, Daddy, again. Again." He pretended to consider it seriously. "I don't know. That's a lot of spinning. Please." He looked over at Serafina and winked. "What do you think, Mommy? Should we spin Emma again?" "I think," Serafina said, one hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child was growing, "that Daddy should come over here and feel the baby kicking." Caspian set Emma down gently and crossed to the swing, settling beside his wife and placing his hand over hers. Almost immediately, there was a strong kick that made him smile. "Active little one," he murmured, just like his sister. She leaned against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him that had become synonymous with home and safety and love. Emma climbed up onto the swing between them, her small body warm and solid. "Is the baby gonna play with me?" "Eventually," Serafina said, stroking her daughter's dark hair. When he gets bigger. How do you know it's a he? Caspian asked. Mother's intuition. She smiled up at him. Besides, I want a little boy who looks just like his daddy. God help us all, Caspian said, but his eyes were soft with love and wonder. As the sun set over the Vermont mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Serafina thought about the journey that had brought them here. The pain and fear, the secrets and lies, the moment when she thought she'd lost him forever. But love had conquered it all. Not the easy, fairy tale kind of love she'd read about in those forbidden romance novels, but the real thing. The kind that survived betrayal and danger, that grew stronger in the face of impossible odds. No regrets? Caspian asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. None, she said firmly. You crossed every limit for me, and I'd do the same for you, even knowing what it would cost. Especially knowing what it would cost. She turned to face him fully, her free hand tracing the line of his jaw. Because some things are worth any price. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, while Emma giggled between them and the baby kicked against her ribs. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Serafina knew with absolute certainty that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, not without scars from the battles they'd fought to get here, but absolutely, completely real. And completely theirs. 10 years later. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the halls of the Thorne Foundation as Serafina walked toward her office, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a stack of grant applications in the other. At 32, she had become something she never could have imagined during her sheltered youth, a powerful advocate for victims of organized crime. The foundation, established with the reward money from the Kozlov case, had grown into one of New England's most respected charitable organizations. They provided legal aid, counseling services, and financial assistance to families whose lives had been shattered by criminal enterprises. It was work that gave meaning to everything they had endured. Mrs. Thorne, her assistant, a bright young woman named Jessica, appeared in the doorway. Your husband called. He's running late from the courthouse, but he'll pick up the kids from school. Thank you, Jess. Serafina settled behind her desk, surrounded by photographs of the families they'd helped and letters from grateful recipients. But her favorite picture sat in the center of it all, Caspian in a simple black tuxedo, spinning her around in their backyard wedding reception, both of them laughing with pure joy. The courthouse visit was routine now. 3 times a year, Caspian testified in trials related to the ongoing prosecutions of Kozlov's network. The organization had been vast, its tentacles reaching into dozens of communities across multiple states. Even 10 years later, they were still uncovering victims and bringing criminals to justice. Her phone buzzed with a text from Caspian. Judge ruled in favor of the Peterson family. Full restitution ordered. Celebration dinner tonight. She smiled, typing back. I'll make reservations. The kids will be thrilled. Emma, now 13, had inherited her father's sharp mind and her mother's compassionate heart. She volunteered at the foundation on weekends, helping organize donation drives and reading to younger children in the counseling center. Their son Michael, 8, was quieter but equally determined to make a difference in the world. Both children knew the truth about their parents' past, told in age-appropriate ways as they grew old enough to understand. They were proud of their father's courage and their mother's strength, but more importantly, they had learned that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. The afternoon passed quickly, filled with meetings about new programs and reviews of funding proposals. As 5 o'clock approached, Serafina gathered her things and headed home to the sprawling farmhouse they'd built on 50 acres outside town. It was everything she dreamed of during those lonely nights in her childhood bedroom, a place filled with warmth, laughter, and unconditional love. Caspian's car was already in the driveway when she arrived, and she could hear voices from the backyard. She found them by the old oak tree they'd planted on their first anniversary, now tall enough to provide shade for the tire swing Caspian had installed last summer. Mommy! Michael launched himself into her arms, chocolate on his face and grass stains on his knees. Daddy said we can have pizza for dinner. Did he now? She looked over at her husband, who was pushing Emma on the swing while she talked animatedly about her day at school. Victory dinner, he said, his eyes meeting hers across the yard. The Petersons will finally get their farm back. That's wonderful. She meant it. Every small victory against the legacy of Kozlov's crimes felt personal, a validation of everything they'd sacrificed to bring him down. Later that evening, after pizza and ice cream and bedtime stories, Serafina and Caspian sat on their front porch watching the sunset. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, both of them content in the comfortable silence that came with a decade of marriage. "Any regrets?" he asked, their old ritual question. "Just one," she said, lifting her head to look at him. His eyebrows rose in surprise. In 10 years, she'd never said anything but no. "I regret that it took a criminal organization to bring us together," she said with a smile. "Imagine how much easier it would have been if we'd just met at a coffee shop." Caspian laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering darkness. "Easier, maybe, but not nearly as memorable." "True." She settled back against him, watching the first stars appear in the sky. "Besides, I wouldn't change a single moment. Not the fear, not the pain, not even that horrible day when you broke my heart. It all led us here." "Here," he repeated softly, his lips brushing the top of her head. "To this perfect, impossible life. To forever," she whispered. And as the night deepened around them, filled with the sounds of their sleeping children and the promise of tomorrow, Serafina knew that some love stories were worth every battle it took to tell them.